Okay, so before Pesach, we started a new parak, Eza Neshech. And what's significant about Eza Neshech is that whereas what we were learning before, which is important and has some pertinence to our today, Neshech and Tarbis, Ribis is a major, major part of the Torah, and we are very much obligated to heed that commandment. So this parak will really go into great detail on this whole subject. Of course, over the years, there's been modifications, and the Rabbanan created, Heter Iska and other things so that it sort of softens the blow. But the Torah says specifically that you should not hold back from lending money to someone because A, you don't know if you're going to get paid back or not, and the value of money and this, that, and the other. So the Torah it makes it very clear and admonishes us that it is our obligation to help people, give tzedakah, even loans. And what's called the Free Loan Society, where the Bechlal is no interest. But this is a subject of much discussion, and we started it, and I'm just going to review what we discussed so we can pick up today. So the Mishnah in Samach Hamid Beis really starts out by telling us that there are two forms of interest, what we know to be interest. There's neshech and there's tarbis. Tarbis means ribis, and then there's neshech. So, and the Torah speaks of both, and we'll quote the pasuk in a minute. So, what is neshech? What is tarbis? So, just basically, neshech applies to loans. I loan you, Jay, $100, and you're going to pay me back $120. That's forbidden. That's neshech. I can't take interest from you. Okay, very straightforward. Torah tells us that. Now, there's something called tarbis. Tarbis has another name, ribis. And ribis does not deal with loans. Ribis deals with business, meaning that in the course of business, I make money on you through the way the business is conducted. I sell you something. In other words, again, we'll get into the specifics, but the important thing is it has nothing to do with a loan. It has to do with we're arm's length, we're doing business, and in the course of business, I have to get something. I have to benefit from it. So therein lies the very complicated halacha, what's permitted and what's not. And we even talked about if I give you money, let's say, or not money, but I sell you wheat, and you buy the wheat for $100, and then in the course of having to pay me back, the wheat appreciates to $120. Is that whose fault is that? Is that ribis? Is there anything wrong with that? If there is an inherent benefit because of the market. So the market is what dictates whether or not you're getting it. So why should I be penalized with ribis because the market changed? So therein, again, we went through the specifics of examples of how it happened. One example, just to remind ourselves, is that I bought a grain. Let's say the Gemara says for a kur. A kur is a denomination that was very popular. It was a gold coin that had 25 silver dinorim, which that's a method of money which we've talked about. So for kur, I bought a grain, but I said, you know what? I don't need all of it now. Hold it for me in your silo. And then while it was in the silo, it appreciated. So who gets the benefit of that? So therein, there's a lot of nuances. And we said one of the things that is allowed for me is because there was an established price. The price was such and such for the wheat, and I paid the prevailing price. Once I paid the prevailing price, you could no longer have a time on me. Oh, wait a minute, you made a windfall if it's now worth 20%, 30% more. Again, we'll revisit that, but that was how the Gemara wanted to look at. So then now it's worth 20% more. So now, subsequent to the initial purchase, I come back to the seller and I say, you know what, I want the rest of my wheat, and it's now worth, instead of 20, it's worth 40. And he said, okay. But the buyer says, you know what? I want that because I want to take that grain and convert it to wine. I want to buy wine. So now I have extra money through the grain, right? Because the appreciation, I want to buy wine. So the seller says to him, I have wine to sell you too. You don't have to go anywhere else. So, and I'll give you wine at the prevailing rate of what your wheat is worth. I said, okay, I'm happy to do that. The one problem is that the seller didn't have the wine with him. He had to go out into the marketplace and buy the wine. But as a good businessman, he immediately didn't want to lose a customer. So he said, come to me, I'll sell you the wine. Now, so everything looks kosher. Now, here's the problem. The problem is he doesn't have the wine. He has to go into the marketplace and buy the wine. And now, when he's buying the wine, in order to give him that same quantity, it's not worth 20 anymore. It's worth 40. He has to spend 40 dinarim to get the wine that originally this fellow had in his credit for 20. Therein lies the problem, because that's what ribis is. Ribis means in the course of the business transaction, because one of the exceptions to the rule is if you have it in your possession, it's just that he doesn't want it right now. That obviates any future problem of ribis because you had to give him. He just didn't want it. But if you don't have it, you have to go out and procure it. Then the problem is if you're procuring it for more than what he gave you as a holding amount of money, then ribis kicks in. So that's an example.
So if he didn't ask for wine, he just wants his wheat back.
That would have been fine.
And even though it's 20% higher, what he's getting back.
Because he bought it, it was all there. He just asked him to hold it.
Yeah, it was in his silo,
It was
whatever.
in his silo. And that's a key difference. Does he have it? Does the seller have it in his possession or not? If he has it in his possession, not a problem. If he doesn't have it in his possession, he opens the door to ribis because later on, if he's going to try to procure whatever it is that he has to give him, then it may have appreciated. So he's getting a windfall. The buyer is getting more than he negotiated. So that's why ribis, neshech, straightforward. I lend it to you, you give me back. Ribis is a lot more subtle because in ribis in business, there's ups, there's downs, there's inflation, there's deflation. And so the question is, how does someone negotiate that difficult terrain when it comes to ribis in business? So basically, I mean, today when people do business, and I know this from firsthand, but when people do business, so if they're Jewish partners or Jewish parties, you sign a heter iska. So basically, that heter iska allows, through a nuanced way of saying that it's not ribis, it's a fee, it's different things. So you sign that at the very beginning, and this way your transactions are sort of outside the limit of ribis. Now, there's no ribis by a non-Jew. So if you're dealing with a non-Jew, a bank, let's say, or something else, then you don't have to worry. But in Israel, for instance, all the banks are Jewish. And people borrow money and do all kinds of things. So again, you have to be very careful. So the Rabbanut certainly tries to enforce that they should follow a certain protocol so that you're not getting involved in ribis. And so it doesn't seem to be a problem, but it is a subtle problem. All right.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just one quick follow-up.
Yeah.
You mentioned fees. So if there are transaction fees, for example, for storing the grain,
Yeah.
for anticipation, is that the workaround? Is that you can charge fees for other things that are not related to the the ups and downs of the market? So if I'm storing it for you, there's a fee. If I'm handling the transaction for you, if I'm converting it from, let's say, wheat to wine, there's all fees. Does that circumvent the ribis problem?
That's a very, very insightful question because therein lies the question whether or not the fee that you charge is that kind of like a tax or something. But if the parties negotiate and say, listen, I'm buying a core worth of wheat, and let's say it's 100 bushels. I can only use 50 bushels now. I want to keep the 50 by you. The seller may say, no problem. You're paying me a good price for the wheat. I'll hold it for you. If, as you point out, He says, look, my silo is packed. I needed to give it to you right now. You want me to keep it? I have to charge you rent. I have to do something. Now we're not talking about ribbis anymore. Now we're talking about a straight business transaction between two parties, and I'm renting you space, and you pay me for that. That, in fact, is not ribbis because now you're outside the arena of I'm going to sell you for 100 and for 100 and you'll get back 120, where it's clear that what you're getting back is ribis is a penalty, if you will, for not a penalty but a business transaction. But in the course of negotiating, if you say I'll do it, but I'll do it and I have to charge you a fee for that, then that's not ribbis. You're absolutely right. So again, depending on how you couch the terms of the deal, you can get around the ribbis issue. That's not what heter iska is, by the way, but that's one way of saying yes. We can transact, we can do business, and I'll pay you a fee for holding it, and then you'll give it to me then.
Same thing is true with a loan. You could have a loan origination fee that might be significantly high, but it's not associated with additional amounts on coming back. So if you
That's
structure it
correct.
that way,
That's correct. That's
permissible.
correct. Right, absolutely right. Once you talk about fees and other things, that's the cost of doing business. That's not ribbis. Ribbis means simply that I'm taxing you on the money that I'm lending you, and I want a premium. If there is a if there is what we call a fee for doing business, because you have to hire lawyers, you have to do this, you have to do, there's always things that go on besides the straight transaction. You have to pay for that. Someone has to pay for that. It's fair to say that the lender is going to pay for everything that he's doing. He says, listen, you want this loan. I'm happy to give you the loan, but you have to pay me for putting it together. That's not ribbis. So you're touching on the right question here, is to get around some of these things. There are origination fees but as long as it's established in advance, so there's no, okay, what happens? And again, right, let's say a loan is for 10 years. So there's no question that you have the 10 years. If you come back after 10 years and say, I want to continue the loan, right? You haven't charged me interest. I want to continue the loan. Then again, there's the question of, okay, so I'm not charging you interest. You're still going to pay me back the same the same core, but the cost of doing business is something I'm allowed to pass on. So you're right. This is touching on things that are outside of interest. And that's kind of how the heter iska looks at things, by saying this is not interest. These are fees or costs of doing business. That generally is what saves you from ribbis.
And nowadays you have tariffs that are, being added on after the original transaction. So how do you cover something that is not under control by the buyer or the seller?
So again, what the Gemara tells us basically is that there are things that are outside of your control. It's not that you're benefiting from me. In other words, we made a transaction, I owe you $100. Now, my obligation is to bring that product and sell it to you. That product now comes from overseas, and all of a sudden it costs me more to give you that product than $100. So since it's not a transaction where where you're paying me for the use of the money. In other words, $100 interest, fine. But things that are beyond your control, those that's where the language of the heter iska comes in, is that you have to carefully enunciate what it is that this business transaction is about. And again, in the era of tariffs, we now have another clause in a contract that has to be negotiated, and saying, listen, I'm not making any money on you. This is the deal. You pay me a fee for the beginning, origination fee, whatever. Now, all of a sudden, out of left field, now, if the deal is already cemented, it's already a done deal, then I don't know that if a tariff sort of gets hit, that the seller may well have to absorb that, because they already have a deal. and the deal is
But can the buyer say, I'm going to invalidate this whole deal because I'm not going to pay the tariff, you know?
right,
I'll
right.
do something else. Whatever
So
it is.
Presumably, there's language in the agreement that's
that's right.
subject to. There's a proviso that if tariffs or taxes are imposed beyond my control, I will not.
Right.
I'll pass it on to you at cost, but you're going to have to pay for any upcharge that occurs as a
And that's not a benefit to the seller. That's a pass-through cost that's costing him the money, and all he's doing is passing the cost on. So, but you're right, the devil's in the details. When you negotiate these very complicated deals, that's why contracts can be 50, 100 pages, is because it covers every one of, as much as we know, every issue. What happens if? So in the world of ribis, we have to sign an agreement that I'm not going to charge you for the money, but if fees and costs and there's a change in the marketplace, that's like an appreciation or a depreciation. But we gave the example in the very beginning.
Oh,
Hey, Rabbi, we can't hear you.
Is if
Oh, there you
while I'm
go.
holding it, it appreciates 20%. That's not ribis. Yeah. So in other words, if let's say one of the exceptions to ribis is that when you do the transaction, it's at prevailing market rates. That's very, very important. Dave, to your question, Michael or David. Or actually it was Jay who asked it. So in other words, the question of tariffs, if it comes in later, wouldn't upset the apple cart because you negotiated at the time on prevailing market rates. The market rate was 1 kur for 100 bushels. That's it. So now whatever happens afterwards isn't ribis anymore. It's a fluctuation of the marketplace. It appreciates, it depreciates. Tariffs is a form, I guess, of depreciation, if you really think about it, because you're paying for something that you didn't expect to, so it's giving you less than what you anticipated. But that's not ribis, because you are already exempt from ribis by having an agreement that the market for 100 bushels is a kur. I'm not asking for discounts. I'm paying the kur. And now, as life would have it, there are changes in the marketplace. So it's a
suppose the seller says, I won't give it to you for that price. I'm passing the tariff over to you as a buyer.
Well, again, if they can't come to an agreement, they go to Bezdin. Bezdin will have to arbitrate whether or not he can do that or not. But in the world of ribis, if it's ribis, they would say right away you can't do it. But in the world of ribis, this isn't ribis. He may not want to do it because it's costing him more money. He's not making a profit. That's a separate question from ribis. And if the parties can't agree, then yeah, they go to Bezdin, and Bezdin has to arbitrate. Maybe they compromise. Usually, pshara is the way that the Bezdin tries to work it out. That everybody should win or lose a little bit. But separate and apart from that issue, the issue of ribis is already satisfied. There is no ribis. Now we've got to work through the marketplace. That's why in business, it is very, very between, I mean, from person, again, if he's conscious of it and he knows he's dealing with other Jewish businessmen, he has to be very, very careful. That's why I say this whole subject is such an impactful one today in our time, especially with business has become even more sort of complex and all. So these are very good questions, tariff and taxes and all these other things, but separate and apart. Okay, so that was the Gemara, the Mishnah and the Gemara basically just summing up. And so the other thing to know before we go in is that neshech, and this is a little subtle here, because neshech is midoraisa and ribis is midrabanan. Now we're going to have a problem because the term ribis, tarbis, is mentioned in the Torah. So how do you get around that? But before we get into that, the basic rule, which is how the Mishnah and the Gemara start out, is that, for instance, the very beginning, we say that the neshech, what the Torah meant is lending. It didn't go into business. Just I can't loan you money and get back a profit. The Rabbanan extrapolated from that. Okay, that's lending, but in the course of business, are you really lending? In other words, there is an element of lending because when you, again, like the example we gave, if I buy something and I ask you to hold it for me, so it isn't straightforward. I buy it and walk away with it. So now we have the subtleties. So the Rabbanon say, you know what? We're going to add this other iser. It's called ribis, and we're going to make you responsible for the same. Now, the problem with that, of course, and that's where we're going to try to pick up, is that ribis is midaraisa. Ribis is midaraisa, and we'll quote the pasuk in a minute. So the question becomes, when you, and this is the overarching question that the Gemara is dealing with, are neshech and ribis two separate things? In other words, does neshech include ribis, tarbis, and does tarbis include neshech? So this, in the last week before, we were going back and forth and saying, no, they're separate. No, they're the same. That's the issue here, is whether or not when you're over the lav of neshech, are you also over the lav of tarbis? And that's where the Gemara tries to go back and forth and show, yes, you are. No, you're not. And that's what we said before, that those are in those circumstances, there's a question of whether or not you're over one over the other. So the Gemara concluded right before our part. It says Elo Amar Rava. That's down near the bottom of Samach Amid Beis, the beginning line. Elo Amar Rava. So Rava says, Yata moitza lo neshech below tarbis, below tarbis below neshech. So Rava comes to the conclusion that you cannot find a case where neshech doesn't include ribis, and ribis doesn't include neshech. They are, and then v'lo chilkin hakosov and v'lav alav mishnei lavin. So why then do we even bother mentioning neshech and tarbis if they really are intertwined in every case? So the interesting answer is because the Torah separated them, and they want you to know how strong this Isser is, that you're over two lavin. It's the same thing, but you're over two lavin, one called neshech, one called tarbis. So they're not separated out, says Rava. They are one and the same. But the reason why we make a slight distinction is to say that when you lend with interest, or you in business do a transaction that is improper, you're over on both neshech and tarbis, two psukim in the Torah. Okay.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Can we just say good morning to Tzvi? I'm sorry.
Good morning, Tzvi. Welcome. Okay, so that's where we're up to. And to go from further, I first want to quote there's two psukim in the Torah which are going to be very important for us to understand, and let's quote them and talk about them for a minute, because one of the psukim deals with a lender, and one pasuk deals with a borrower. And mind you, the issue of ribis is on both. I can't lend you, and you can't pay me. In other words, I lend you the $100, and I say pay me back 120. You have to say, I can't pay you 120. It's ribis. So I'm over a lav. Me, the borrower, I'm over a lav if I pay you ribis. How do we know this? So the first pasuk in the Torah is in Vayikra, where the pasuk says, "Es kaspacha lo siten lo beneshech." This deals with a lender. Your money you should not give him with neshech, but marbis lo siten ochlecho. And for ribis, you should not give him your food. What does this demonstrate? It demonstrates, at least from this pasuk, that the lender cannot lend money or give him give him food. In other words, I'm giving you $100 worth of wheat, food. You're going to pay me back $120 worth of food. It's not money. Again, we're making a distinction now between kesef and oichel. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but since the Torah talks about kesef and ochel, there is a question which we will address. What about something that's not kesef or ochel? Machinery, you name it, anything out there that isn't food or money, how does that fit into the picture? That will be an issue, keep in mind. But right now, the pasuk doesn't deal with that. The pasuk says that I, as a lender, cannot lend you neshech on money, and tarbis, marbis, lositan achlacha, I cannot charge you on food. So that's a lender-related issue. Now, let's go to Devarim. And in Devarim, now we're talking about a borrower. So listen to the lashon. Neshech kesef. You should not pay to your friend, meaning the lender. You, the borrower, should not pay neshech kesef. Neshech ochel, using the word neshech. Neshech food. Neshech kol davar asher yishoch, or neshech on anything that you will have in an interest. So this pasuk is broader. This pasuk first talks about a borrower, and I said that a borrower is equally a chayiv in this avera if he pays. But here the Torah uses different terminology. It says neshech kesef, not tarbis ochel, but neshech ochel, and then goes to the next line, neshech kol davar, meaning anything other than money and food. So this is very important for our understanding, because the Gemara is now going to get into the understanding of the pshat, why one pasuk is like this, one pasuk is like that, what's the meaning of the pasuk. So we're really going to see a very interesting shaklavitaria now in the Gemara on this whole question of neshech and tarbis. Okay, so we concluded with Rava, that's what Rava said. That's basically brings us to where we are today. So today, So the Gemara wants to give, now picks up from what Rava says. And so right now we're at the point where neshech and tarbis are indistinguishable, that when you're over one, you're over the other. Okay, that's what we want to extrapolate from the Torah. Torah Rabbanan. So now the Rabbanan learned in a brisa. Okay, and that brisa is based on the pasuk we just said. The Torah says in Devarim, in Torah says in Vayikra, in the portion having to do with the lender, it says, "Es kasbacha lo sitin lo beneshech." You should not give kesef in monetary. You shouldn't take neshech. He quotes the pasuk, so you're not allowed to do it. Says the Gemara, "Ein li ela neshech bekesef aribas ba'oichel." From this pasuk, straightforward from the language of the pasuk, I would say that there's neshech by kesef and tarbis by ochel. I wouldn't say that there is one and the same by both, because why did the Torah enunciate specifically? If the Torah wanted to say they're one and the same, this is not what it would have said in the language. The Torah would have modified and said neshech and tarbis by kesef, neshech and tarbis by ochel. It says specifically, enli and neshech by kesef and tarbis by ochel. Neshech ba'ochel minayin. How do we know neshech ba'ochel? How do we know that? Talmud lomar. Therefore, the Torah says neshech ochel. In the second pasuk, dealing with the borrower, it says neshech ochel. So, in other words, we're taking the two psukim together. We're not going to say, oh, one is a lender, one is a borrower. They have nothing to do with each other. The Torah, the brisa wants to extrapolate that once we have two psukim in the Torah, you have to integrate the psukim. And you have to say, even though the first pasuk says neshech b'kesef and tarbis ba'ochel, but the second pasuk says neshech ba'ochel. If there's neshech ba'ochel, you can't get away from the fact that the term neshech applies to food. So that's how the brisa comes to support Rava's view that what? That they're one and the same. You can't distinguish. Because the psukim, and it's based on a pasuk. It isn't based on anything else. It's based on a pasuk, where by the borrow it says neshech ochel. Okay, so fine. So now we've this brisa gives us an insight into Rava's svara. Now let's ask the other question: ribis bekesef minayin. The only time it says the word ribis in both psukim is by ochel. How do you know this ribis by kesef? We know this neshech by ochel because the pasuk says so. But where do you know ribis by by kesef? That's the Gemara's kasha. In other words, the Gemara is being very specific. You want to learn something out from the pasuk? I'll grant you. You're right. The pasuk in Devarim modifies the pasuk in Vayikra, and you take them both together. But even if you take them both together, there's no mention of ribis by kesef. So how can you, Rava, say that one and the other are the same? Where your proof? In other words, you can't just say it. We're bringing a raya from a brisa. A brisa are the Tanoim who extrapolated. We're now talking the Amoraim and later years, and they want to say, wait a minute. The Tanoim in the brisa made it very clear that neshech applies. But where does ribis apply? So that's the Gemara's kasha. Ribis, because of benayin, how do we know? Says the brisa, Talmud loymar. The Torah says what? Neshech kesef. That you shouldn't pay neshech on kesef. So now this brisa is going to have to explain to us where neshech on ochel applies. Okay, so how do we know that? So says the Gemara, im ene inyan leneshech kesef. Since it can't mean, even though it says neshech kesef, you have to follow this. Is very interesting. Even though it says in the pasuk neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar, you can't say that the neshech is what we're talking about in money. Why? Shehakavar nema lo sashich leochicha. It previously says that there is you can't charge neshech to your brother, right? Tanoi inyan l'ribis kesef. Therefore, you have to take away what is the plain meaning of the pasuk and says that neshech refers only to kesef, and you have to say it means ribis. So this is a little bit of an extrapolation in the brisa. What does he want to say? The pasuk says, Lo sashich lochicha neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar. Okay, so now, if the pasuk enlarges the issue by saying kol davar, so neshech applies to everything. What about ribis? Says the brisa. Now, you can't say neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar and mean only neshech, because the neshech kol davar is totally inclusive. So now you have to understand what does the Torah mean when it says neshech kesef, neshech ochel? It means tarbis. In other words, the brisa says you got to think about this a little bit differently. The Torah has no extra words. So if it says neshech kesef, neshech tarbis, neshech kol davar, why do you need kol davar? You already have, and it says a kol davar, meaning every other commodity. But you can't now say that because it says neshech kol davar, we mean neshech kesef and neshech ochel. You can't do that because neshech kol davar is totally inclusive of neshech. So you have to say when the Torah says neshech, it means tarbis. So that would be an understanding that tarbis kesef and tarbis ochel are also included. Because the Gemara asks the kasha, ribis bekesef minayin. How do you know ribis, tarbis? By kesef.
Excuse me, Rav, they seem to be joining the two words.
That's right. We want to bring a raya to Rava that they're totally interchangeable. So that we bring a raya from a brisa. But the brisa says, wait a minute, you only given me a raya on neshech. How do you know tarbis?
Right.
It doesn't say tarbis by kesef. The Torah says inherently it means tarbis by kesef because by saying neshech bekesef, neshech neshech beochel, neshech bechol davar, the word kol davar.
The kol davar has to include anything and everything.
Exactly right. So now it would be redundant to say neshech kesef, neshech oichel. So the neshech no longer means neshech; it means tarbis. That's how the brisa interprets again, this is the Rabbanan of the time, the Ketanoim, with their insightful thinking. They asked the plain question: how does the Torah lay this out for us, that it shouldn't be every word in the Torah has a specific meaning, and here we're just going to throw around the words neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech
Now it's like we have too many words.
right, too many, right?
Right, the Torah has too many words because we can explain it simply.
Exactly right. So therefore we have to say, no, it's not too many words. The Torah has a specific meaning when it says neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar. It means that neshech applies to everything. And since neshech applies to everything, why enunciate neshech kesef, neshech ochel? You already have kol davar. Teretz is because tarbis is what the Torah means when it says neshech. It doesn't mean neshech, it means tarbis. That's how the Tanoim extrapolate. That's what this brisa is telling us. It says you shouldn't give neshech, right?
So the Rabbanan are disagreeing with the basic words that are written in the Torah.
Yeah. Say it again. You have to what?
It sounds like the Rabbanan were disagreeing with the plain words in the psukim.
No, they weren't disagreeing. They were saying inherently the Torah means ribis when it says neshech. Remember, the objective here is to say neshech and tarbis are the same thing, and you get two lavin. I mean, that's how we concluded until now. In other words, don't confuse neshech and tarbis, two separate things. When you charge neshech, you mean tarbis, and tarbis means neshech. Okay, now let me back up a minute. One of the things we said until now in the previous weeks is that why is it called neshech and why is it called tarbis? Let me just repeat that neshech means biting. What does it mean to bite? When I lend you $100 and you have to pay me 120, I'm biting you because I'm hurting you. I'm biting you. You're paying me back more than I gave you. That's called neshech. What is tarbis? Tarbis doesn't mean biting. Tarbis means I am the beneficiary. I'm gaining on your benefit. I gave you $100. You give me back 120. So you're being hurt, but I'm gaining. Now, why is that important? Because again, I'll repeat it again, but there are instances when, for instance, let me go back. We said in previous Gemaras, you'll remember, that there was a question of whether or not monies or commodities, silver, gold, copper, are the means of exchange in money. We had this whole discussion, and the Gemara ultimately says that silver is the common coin of the realm, so everything is based on silver. Okay, so I'm going to have apothecate an example. I have a silver coin, and I lend you a silver coin. The silver coin is worth 100 prutas of copper. Fine. Now, the fluctuation in the marketplace is that and the Gemara uses the term danka. The silver is a danka. That's what we had in the past. So this silver coin is worth 100 prutas. Now, through appreciation, inflation, whatever, it now takes 120 prutas to buy a danka. So now let's look at this. The borrower is paying more than he's paying back more. It's costing him more. It's neshech. It's costing him more because he now has to pay 120 prutas for that danka. But is the lender making a profit? Not really, because he's lent a danka and he got back a danka. And that's all that matters. Forget about what the danka is worth. It's a danka. It's a silver coin. That's the coin we're dealing with. So is there ribis? There's no ribis because he's not benefiting from that appreciation. He has the same danka as he had before. So on the surface, we see a situation where ribis applies, neshech applies, and ribis doesn't. So why is that material? It's material because
the dankas has changed value.
But it's still a danka. No. You're right. It's changed value, but for purposes of what he lent him a silver coin, and he got back a silver coin. Just look at the surface. I lent you a coin, I got back a coin, I made nothing from you. You're right. Underneath there's something, but that's not ribis, because from the ribis from the standpoint of the lender has not changed. And we're saying that the silver coin is what you base you don't base it on the fact that the copper coins appreciated to 120. That's immaterial. It's what is the silver coin, the coin of the realm. Coin of the realm is the same. If you would give me back a danka, two dankas, or a danka and other coins, fine. I would say there's ribis. But why is there's no ribis here? I'm getting back what I gave you. So again, what we see here is that, so Rava says,
It's
no,
hard to separate the fact that he's getting back the same object, but obviously the values have changed.
but the values don't matter. That's, I think the point
But the
is,
bank account of the lender is lost money, let's say, compared to the borrower. In other
so,
words, somebody's lost money here.
well,
Rabbi, is the implication that neshech is ribis, but ribis is not necessarily neshech?
so that's what the Gemara wanted to think, because it said that if they're the same, how do you know there's ribis by kesef? Exactly, the Gemara's kasha. In other words, why are there? So the Gemara says, you know why there's ribis by kesef is because the posuk in its language uses superfluous words, and those superfluous words we learn out. We darshan that from those superfluous words, the Torah didn't mean neshech by kesef, it meant tarbis by kesef. So in other words, to your question, you can't separate them out, because by mere fact that the Torah uses these terms, you have to understand that those terms have a broad implication. When the Torah says neshech kesef, it doesn't mean neshech kesef. Why doesn't it mean neshech kesef? Because it says neshech kol davar. Once you have kol davar, why do you need neshech kesef and neshech ochel? And I'm repeating myself first by saying neshech kesef, then neshech ochel, and then neshech kol davar. That's totally superfluous. Because it's superfluous, say the Rabbanan, we have to understand what the Torah meant. What the Torah meant to tell us is that there's neshech by kol davar, but there's also tarbis by
Some
kesef.
of the things.
Right. So in other words, you're backing into it by saying that the Torah, we don't ask Akasha why the Torah should have said tarbis kesef, tarbis
Would have made it easier.
it would have made it easier, 100%. But it didn't say it. And on the surface, it looks odd. Why? Because why say it? It's superfluous. So the Rabbanan, the Brisa says, no, the Torah didn't mean to add superfluous language. It meant to be inclusive by saying that since Neshech is B'chol Dover, not Tarbis B'chol Dover, Neshech B'chol Dover, therefore when I previously said Neshech Kesef, Neshech Ochel, I meant Tarbis. It's interesting, because that's, it takes a leap of understanding to come to that conclusion. What we were learning says neshech. What are you telling me, tarbis? It says neshech. But in other words, it includes to exclude. It includes neshech in everything, to exclude that when it says neshech kesef and neshech ochel, it means tarbis kesef and tarbis ochel. So it takes it takes an understanding that the Torah meant to say it. Why it didn't say it, we don't know. But it had to mean that, because the Torah never would have been redundant to tell us 3 different times, Neshech Kesef, Neshech Ochel, Neshech Kol Davar. It would not have done that.
So at the yeshiva discussion, it must have taken them a long time to say, we have sort of redundancy here. What are the possible explanations? And there are probably 10 different explanations, but it's settled on the one that we end up as the final. The implication of
Right.
the redundancy turns out to be this,
Well,
which
that's
we voted on.
okay. Why would the Gemara have asked the question Tarbis Bekesef Menai? In other words, again, this is the Shakla Torah. We're going back and forth. So the Gemara says, Okay, I understand everything you're telling me, but how do you know ribis by? In other words, the Gemara is breaking down to us what the questions and answers were and how we arrived at it. So the Gemara asks, ribis bekesef minayin. I'm very good with neshech. Neshech is okay, but how do you know? The pasuk only says tarbis by oichel. How do you know tarbis by money? Says the Gemara because by implication, it has to mean tarbis by money. Otherwise, the pasuk would not have been as redundant as it is by saying neshech kesef, neshech och, and neshech koldover. So you're right. We have to go through the timeline. The timeline started here. You ask the kasha. Now you come back to the terrace. And now everything is good in the world because now we see that we have, and this is just proof to Rava that when I lend you money, I'm over on Neshech and on Tarbis. And when I do business with you and there's a business issue, I'm also over Neshech and Tarbis. They're inseparable. And as the Gemara said, the purpose of why they're inseparable is to tell us you're over two lavin. Why did the Torah say you're over two lavin? Because the Torah wanted you to understand the seriousness of what you're doing and saying there's two perspectives here. There's the perspective of the Neshech, the biting against the borrower, and the tarbis, the benefit to the lender or to the businessman. So in other words, they're two sides of the same coin, right? You get hurt, I get a benefit. If you don't get hurt, I don't get a benefit. So the Torah says, you know what? You're over twice. You hurt him and you benefited, and the Torah says you can't benefit. Torah says you can't lend on ribis. So this is a fascinating insight in how the Torah how the Torah works. Okay, so we'll go a little bit further. Again, just to understand the deeper thinking. Brek the Gemara ainli ela belove b'malva menayin. So now the pasuk on ribis by money is only in the pasuk by the love, by the borrower, right? What does it say by the borrower? So let's look again. The pasuk in Devarim, which speaks by the borrower, it says, sorry. The pasuk by the borrower is in Vayikra. So let's look at Vayikra. And what does the pasuk says? The pasuk says, "Es kaspacha lo siten lo beneshech." That from the borrower's standpoint, he should not give him money beneshech. Ubamarbis lo siten ochlacha. So again, in this particular case, it doesn't say kol davar. The word kol davar doesn't apply here. The word kol davar applies only by the borrower. The borrower should not pay back neshech by anything. So now the Gemara wants to break it down. Remember, we already know the answer. We know that everything applies, neshech, karbis, everything applies. But the Gemara breaks it down for us and asks the Shaklavataria, okay, I understand you explained the pasuk to me. The pasuk says kol davar, therefore ribis has to apply by money. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. Now the Gemara asks the kasha, wait a minute. This whole discussion is ainli ela belove. This whole discussion is only by the borrower, right? Because the word neshech to the borrower means ribis. B'malva minayin. How do I know from the malva standpoint that ribis applies to money? Because in the pasuk of the lender, there's no mention of ribis by money. There is mention of ribis by money for the borrower, which we just explained. But by the lender, as kaspa, your money you shouldn't give v'neshech. Where does it say that you shouldn't that there's ribis by money? It doesn't say it. So the Gemara wants to break it down again and said, what you told me is very nice. It's a beautiful interpretation because what the Torah means. But that pasuk only deals by a borrower, not by a lender. Now, again, we're going to answer that question, but the Gemara is trying to make us think that even though we just gave an answer, that ribis applies by money, now we can walk away and be happy ribis applies by money. the Gemara wants us to think further. Since we're learning from a pasuk in the Torah, what the pasuk in the Torah is only by the borrower. Why isn't the pasuk in the Torah by the lender too, which we would extrapolate that ribis applies to money? So you now have an opening to argue ribis doesn't apply by money on the lender side, only on the borrower side. Why? Because the Torah says explicitly neshech b'chol davar. So we have to learn that it doesn't mean neshech, it means tarbis. So in other words, the question here is the Torah is exact. If the Torah meant to tell us that by the lender there is ribis by money, it would have said it, just like it said it by the borrower. That's the Gemara's kasha. Ainli ela belova. I know everything that we just talked about by the lova. But malva minayin, how do you know by malva that ribis applies to money? Right? Is it clear? Because it clearly applies. Ribis applies to money, but only on the lova side, because only on the pasuk in the Torah dealing with the lova. On the pasuk dealing in the Torah with malva, it does not give us an opening to argue that ribis applies by money.
But how can you analyze something and ignore the lender?
No, it's not ignoring. The answer was a beautiful answer. Neshech l'kol davar means that there's ribis by kesef. That's a beautiful answer. But wait, that's only an answer.
Sides.
That's only an answer by the borrower. In other words, we have now a taina on the Torah. The Torah wants to teach us something. Teach it to us. Tell us that there is ribis by money by the lender. And all we see by the lender is as lo beneshech. You can't lend him money by neshech. It says nothing about
for the pasuk for the kolbo. That pasuk,
that's only for the borrower.
How do we know that it's only the borrower?
Because look at the lashon of the pasuk. The pasuk says, here, let's read the pasuk again. The pasuk says, remember we said that by ribis everybody's liable, not just the lender, but the borrower too. So, right. So let's look at the pasuk. What does the pasuk say? Lo sashich lo achicha, you should not pay to your brother neshech kesef, neshech ochel, neshech kol davar. You shouldn't pay to your brother. You, the borrower, shouldn't. There's a lav on the Torah on the borrower not to pay. In that pasuk, it says neshech kol davar. But on the flip side, when the pasuk tells us that the lender can't charge, he doesn't say kol davar. So why should I extrapolate that since there's no kol davar, that ribis applies to money, right? It's a beautiful kasha, because you really have to follow the Torah. The Torah tells us something on the lender side and not on the borrower side. There's a reason for that. The reason is because ribis applies on the one hand and doesn't apply on the other hand. Therefore, the Gemara asks the kasha, Ainli ela belova. I know ribis by money, by the lova, because that pasuk really tells us that. But malva minayin, how do we know by the malva that there is ribis by kesef? So we'll conclude by saying, Nema. So we're going to learn from a gzeira shava. Gzeira shava means that we find a common theme or a common word, and we say, if there's a common word that applies here, it applies there. That's a famous phrase in the Gemara. Learn b'gzeira shava. Right. The Torah doesn't say it, right? But the gzeira shava of the Torah Shabbal Peh, meaning the Tanoim, they extrapolate that what the Torah means is this. Now, so what's the gzeira shava? Nema neshech belove. The word neshech appears in both psukim, by the lender and by the borrower. So since it applies by both psukim, ma neshech ha'omer belove, the neshech that we just learned by love, lo chalakta bo ben kesef ben ochel, right? We do not we don't distinguish in between kesef and ochel, that ribis applies to both. Bein beneshech, bein betarbis. And not ben beribis. In other words, just to repeat, we know from the pasuk by the lover that the words are totally interchangeable. Neshech, tarbis. The Torah uses the word neshech, but it means tarbis, and we prove that because it says cold over. But even though it doesn't say in so many words that what? That ribis applies by money. Af neshech omer b'malve. The word neshech appearing by the malva lo tachlok bo ben kesef ben ochel ben neshech ben tarbis. So now the Gemara says, you know what? I'm very satisfied. Why? Because this Gezerah Shava opens the door for me to say the Torah doesn't have to tell us by the lender,
Oh, yeah.
by the malveh. It doesn't have to tell us that ribis applies. It applies because of the Gezerah Shava. Once you define a term in the Torah, you can't say that term applies here, but not there. Now we know that the word neshech means tarbis. How do we know it? Because in the borrower's case, we already said it means tarbis. In the malveh's case, it doesn't say tarbis. It doesn't have to say tarbis anymore because the Gezerah Shava tells us just like neshech means ribis by the borrower, so it means ribis by the lender, which is a beautiful understanding. So that this is how, from the Torah, we would only understand the rigid words of neshech, tarbis, nothing more. But it takes the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which interprets the Torah Shebiksav, to explain to us that the terms aren't exclusive, mutually exclusive. They are the same term, but in different words. But at the end of the day, bein b'malve, bein b'love, bein b'ribis, bein b'neshech, it all applies to everything. And that was the original Gemara's Kasha. Gemara's Kasha was when it says Eza Neshech and says in the beginning, this is Neshech and this is Tarbis. We started out by thinking that they're two separate tracks.
Right.
Now the Gemara shows us they're not two separate tracks, that Ribis, Tarbis, and Neshech are one and the same, but you get two Averas. That's what the implication is, that in terms of telling us the strictness of not dealing in this whole parsha, that you're over to lavin. All right.
Rabbi, can you explain practically something?
Yes.
So let's say a malva lends a mana of gold.
Right.
Let's say the mana of gold at the time of the loan was 100 shekels.
Right.
And the loan repayment, let's just say it was a year.
Yep.
And a year later it was worth 200 shekels.
Right.
So what is the implication? If he returns a mana of gold a year hence, he's paying more in value there. Does that mean that the malva can't accept the mana of gold because it's now worth more than it was then in value? Because that would be ribis because of appreciation? Or does it mean he certainly can, or does the malva have to accept under the new valuation a half mana of gold, which was the equivalent before?
Okay. So that question really sums up the entire Gemara. In the Havamina of the Gemara, which we touched on, you're absolutely right, that since he lent him a mana and is getting back a mana, the lender made no profit because the same gold coin that he gave him, he has now in his pocket. But the borrower is penalized because the borrower now has to pay 200 shekel instead of 100 shekel. So, l'chora, there is neshech and no tarbis. That was the Havamina of the Gemara. Perfectly said. But now we've concluded that you can't separate them out. To your point, the neshech is there, but so is the tarbis because the lender, is now getting back a mana that's worth 200 shekel. So now in the conclusion of the Gemara, you're right. Now and we say there's no daylight between neshech and tarbis. They're one and the same, two sides of the coin. The neshech refers to the love, the tarbis refers to the malve, and if they enter into this transaction, they both get a lav. Now, how do they avoid getting a lav? They have to sit down together and sort of figure out. He has to tell him, you know what? You got to give me a half a mana, like you just said, because if you give me a mana, we're both over a lav. So if you have to give me a half a mana so that
And they can't split the difference. They can't sit down and agree to split the difference. They'll both still be over.
not if it wasn't stated at the outset. Remember that ribis is a discussion that you negotiate and then it happens. Once it happens, you can't say, "Oh, lemafreya, I meant something else." You can't go back in time and say, "Now I have to give you 200 shekel." But wait a minute. No, I don't have to give you 200 shekel. I'm only giving you 100 shekel because the value of the money depreciated. That's the problem with ribis. In other words, if you don't enunciate it, then it happens later. You get in trouble.
So the only way to avoid this is to say on both sides, if it depreciates in value, here's what happens, and if it appreciates in value, this is what happens in
Right.
terms of us, and and come up with a formula. And in between, if it's exactly the same, then it's fine.
Correct.
Then there's no ribis.
Correct.
But that's not always practically possible. So I know this is going to be I assume we're going to go into this in much more depth.
Right.
But
why do you say that? Why do you say it's not practically possible? Why?
Because you don't, not every contract says, if you loan someone a money, it's really complicated. So we got to go through and put together a complicated agreement that says,
Yeah.
This is what we're going to do in case this
Right.
happens.
Right.
And who pays for? I mean, like we said, there's a loan origination fee. There's
those lawyers
that you have
The lawyers, right?
But in essence, then it doesn't. The idea in the Torah is to make lending easier. You're supposed to lend to your friend. If you have to go through all this sorrows, I won't want to lend to my
right. So okay, you're right. So the Torah is saying that let's talk this through at the outset. Now remember, there is an exception to this whole ribis deal, which says that if you negotiate at prevailing market, this is very important. If we negotiate a deal for the wheat or whatever let's say the food, and we do a loan is a loan. A loan is very straightforward. I lend you 100, you give me 120, no problem.
pure numbers.
What's that?
It's pure numbers.
It's pure, right. The real problem is in the commodity, or let's call it in the ochel. In other words, the business side, not the lending side. So in the business side, yeah, we have a problem. But there's an exception to the rule. The exception to the rule is that if when we do this transaction, there is a prevailing market, everybody knows that this food is 100 shekel, then later, if there's an appreciation, there's no more ribis, because we now say, we create a fiction. What's the fiction? I bought the whole thing. I'm not taking the whole thing, but I bought the whole thing. If I bought the whole thing at the time, it was only 100. The fact that it appreciated on my watch. I own it. So it appreciated on my watch, not on your watch. You, Malva, are not giving me more than I bargained for because I already paid for it. That's pshat prevailing market. Prevailing market means everybody knows that 100 shekel will buy this amount of the food. And the only problem is if I get the food later and it appreciates, or like you said, there's a tariff or who knows what. But that no longer becomes a problem if I've bought it in advance, I've paid for it in advance, it appreciates, or whatever happens, tariff, whatever, it happens on my watch, me, the owner of it, not you, the lender or the seller. So there's no problem with ribis anymore because you didn't hurt me or benefit me. I did it myself. I own it. What happens if I own it? And now because I own it, it's as if I have it in my possession, but I don't. And there's a tariff. I have to absorb the tariff, not you.
But if it depreciates in value,
I get the windfall. The owner, the borrower, the owner get the windfall, not you. There's no.
But you also get the loss in that case.
That's correct. You get the benefit or the loss
because the transaction has happened that there's been an exchange and you own it. So
Correct.
whatever happens after that,
That's right. Doesn't matter anymore.
it
It's
doesn't matter.
open-ended.
But in
No,
a
it's
last,
open-ended, but in effect, we're saying you own it. You take the risks of fluctuation.
Right.
You, the owner, take the risk of
so I
fluctuation.
don't understand if you lend someone a gold money and why they why they don't return it as it was. There's a risk to the malva that it will go down and a risk that it will go up.
But all we care about is that he returns the mana, and if the mana is the coin of the realm, then he hasn't benefited because he gave him a mana and got back a mana. He
But
gave
if
him a
it's a
mana.
but if it's a money of gold, not of silver,
Oh, right. Okay. So
then
now,
it's
yeah.
then you have a
Right. Because then, right. But we're talking. Okay, right. You're right because the money gold is not the coin we're dealing with. But if we're talking about silver, which is the coin of the realm, and you lend silver and you get back silver, okay, technically you're correct. But what's the point here? The point is that ribis, neshech ribis, only happens when the parties do a transaction which is somewhat open-ended. If it's open-ended, then there is the possibility of tarbis, of ribis. If it's not open-ended, because I bought from you, Michael, 100 bushels for X dollars. And again, if it's I bought it. It's in my warehouse, but it's not in my warehouse. It's in your warehouse, but I technically own it. Now it appreciates in price or even depreciates in price. There's no longer a ribis issue because I'm playing with my stuff. I'm not playing with your food. If it's your food I'm playing with, yeah, it could be ribis. But if I'm playing with my own money and my own food, I take the risk. It either goes up in value or goes down in value. That's one of the exceptions to ribis, which that's what partially is incorporated into this heter iska, is you have to use that language. And if you use the language um, that I'm selling you 100 bushels, then the language in the heter iska will reflect that you've bought it all. It's in your possession. That becomes the exception to the ribis rule. Once it's in your possession, we don't worry about ribis anymore because now everything that happens later happens to me, not in the transaction to you. It happens to me. I gained or I lost.
unless there's damage to the commodity. So if it's unless you have it in the agreement, if you
Oh,
know,
wait a minute. If there's damage, if there's a pestilence and there's a damage to
yeah,
the commodity, I lose because it's mine. I
It's in
already
my
owned it.
silo. It's in my silo.
It's as if
no.
it could be in the silo of the seller, but it's as if I put it in my rishus, even though it's in his technical rishus. And if there's a pestilence or there's worms or everything else, I bear the
The
responsibility.
agreement has to be specific to that. So the
That's
point is,
right.
if it's not, then the purchaser owns it, and the risk is on him unless he has
Correct.
a proviso in there.
Exactly. And that's what the Heta Iska tries to accomplish. It tries to take the uncertainty of fluctuations, which would be ribis, and say they're no longer uncertainties. This is what it is. If the price changes, tough luck. It's yours or it's not yours. But you're not now going to get a windfall benefit because you put it on a layaway. So a layaway means I own it. Right? That's the pshat. That's yeah, again, it takes you have to extrapolate and think about it. So this is where we are now. Again, bottom line, ribis, neshech, we've now proved that neshech applies to the lova and to the malva, and it applies by food and it applies by money. So that's where we are right now. We'll go over some of the Rashis next week to expect, but this is where we are. And from here, we'll have another jumping off point. We're not finished. There's a lot more to understand here, but as a practical matter, we're now saying that neshech and tarbis are inextricable. They are two sides of the same coin. With this neshech, there's tarbis. With this tarbis, there's neshech. So that's what we are. It's, again,
I didn't realize we signed up for a graduate course.
the graduate course
For this.
in finance.
Yeah, definitely graduate.
Rabbi is beautiful.